Hello, everyone. Welcome to Anthro-Perspectives. This week we have with us Dr. Romina da Costa. She has her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Yale, her master's of education from Harvard, and her PhD in international education policy from the University of Maryland. She's now in the HR space and is the co-founder of a company called Epico. And I just want to read what Epico is about so that everyone gets an understanding here. At Epico, we are focused on developing employee onboarding, leadership, and team training programs that impact talent retention for growing businesses and startups. Ultimately, our clients experience increased innovation and productivity on their teams by holding on to the greatest asset, their people. Well, if that doesn't sum up what HR is supposed to be, I don't know what does. So it's a great meeting and talking to you today. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, where you work, and what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, Keith. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
I am an anthropologist by background, like you said, and most of my professional years have been spent in the fields of international development and education and training. And I've always been an entrepreneur as well. So I have startup experience in China following my bachelor's degree. And currently, like you said, I have a new startup called Epico, where we really focus on developing or kind of being almost like an outsourced HR consultant of sorts in the areas of leadership development, team dynamics training, and structures like employee onboarding and so on that are so important to culture, to retention, and to this focus on people operations.
Mm-hmm.
So I taught at the Leadership Studies program at the University of Maryland while I was there getting my PhD. And I really, my partner and I, Ann Spear, I met her during my PhD at the University of Maryland. We both taught leadership studies, and we really felt like we've never really fit into any particular career, at least like our personalities and such, and our interests are pretty broad. So just bringing together our interests in talent development and training and education, our understanding of how people learn, as well as the research that I did for my PhD, which was definitely in the area of organizations, women, especially and other minorities in STEM fields, and how it is that organizational culture and workplace culture impacts our abilities to retain women and to retain minorities in certain spaces, especially traditionally male-dominated spaces like STEM and engineering and tech. So that's where we're coming from, and where our work with Epico began.
Fantastic. And that's totally the space I would like to work in, is the whole relationship, organizational culture, and leadership, and diversity and inclusion. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking about sort of the culture of leadership in itself recently, but we can talk more about that later. Since you're working in the talent and recruiting HR space, tell us, what do you think are the top skills that anthropologists could bring to any company?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because a lot of times, when I told people I was an anthropology major, I think in their minds, they automatically thought archaeology. So they're like, oh, so you're like digging for bones and things like that. And that's not really it, right?
Right.
Anthropologists, our training is really about learning to observe, I would say, learning to really deeply just look at what's going on around us, to be humble in a way, and to be good listeners, to really tease out people's stories and what they have to say and how they interpret the world around them. And we also become kind of acutely aware of a lot of the things that go unspoken, right? Those things that we take for granted or that we just consider a part of the normal way that things are always done. Anthropologists are really good at identifying those things and teasing them apart and pointing them out to you in such a way that something that is familiar, it's almost like you're seeing it for the first time. And I think that in any organization, in any business especially, the ability to do that, right? To question the things that never go questioned about the way that things have always been done or are being done is really important, especially when you want to change, when you want to innovate, when you want to transform and improve on something. It's really important to be able to dissect and to really question how it is that things are done and why they're done a certain way. And so I think that especially when it comes to organizational culture and a lot of the complex transformations that we see businesses wanting to go through or wanting to promote, having an anthropologist on board is really going to be like your secret superpower for insights.
Secret power, secret weapon, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there because the phrase "the unacknowledged obvious," right?
Mm-hmm,
We're the ones for exposing the elephant in the room that no one is talking about, but it's right there. Everyone sees it. And sometimes they don't see it though, or they pretend not to see it, but it's there. And
exactly.
that's the kind of thing we have to expose and to improve organizational culture, improve culture in general. You've got to deal with it. And back to the elephant analogy, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It takes a lot of work, right? So,
Exactly.
so yeah, that's very good. That's exactly what we do. So what do hiring managers and recruiters need to know to understand the value of the anthropological skill set?
Yeah, so along with the skills that I've already kind of discussed, I do think that when you see a candidate who has a background in anthropology, I think that you can have the confidence that they know how to gather and analyze information. They know how to synthesize complex information from a variety of sources in order to identify patterns and really be able to discern patterns from the noise
Mhm.
and put a name to things that you have never maybe even acknowledged as needing a name, right? And to phenomena really, because in this data driven world that we live in, I think that there's sometimes a tendency to oversimplify, right? Things get a complex situation might get summarized in a statistic or some financial data point or something like that. When the truth is that our world is complicated and that certain things are complex. And that being able to grapple with complexity is also a really important skill. So yes, like being able to simplify something and make it palpable is an important skill, but the opposite of that is also just as important, if not more important, which is the ability to really grapple with complex things and make sense of them without being intimidated by the complexity. And I think that anthropologists are comfortable doing that.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about how when you tell people you're an anthropologist, immediately people think of archaeology. And I wonder sometimes how many hiring managers and recruiters, when they see a resume and they see anthropology, that's the first thing they think of. It's like, what does this have to do with anything that we have here at this company?
Exactly.
So have you just as a side question, have you in your work dealt with people with anthropology backgrounds and maybe help them get placed or anything like that?
So not directly, or at least not in that way. I feel like I've worked a lot with people who have used anthropological ethnography or other anthropological methods. I have worked with anthropologists, not necessarily in the recruitment space, but in other areas as well, including things like organizational research, market and product research as well, and so on. I haven't necessarily worked to place an anthropologist anywhere though.
So one of the topics that comes up on LinkedIn periodically for discussion is the concept of culture, and in this case, the concept of organizational culture. So, what is your definition of organizational culture?
That's a good one. Organizational culture, it's not easy to define, but I would say that we can look at it as a set of shared values, of shared beliefs, and they guide behavior. So they guide almost any interaction in an organization is silently shaped by that organization's culture,
Mhm.
whether it's the way that teams conduct projects, the way that feedback is given, the way that conflicts are dealt with.
Mm.
They are the spoken and the unspoken, but mostly the unspoken rules that guide and normalize our behavior. So, yeah, they're things that people can't really put a finger on a lot of the time, but that is kind of silently and behind the scenes. It's almost like the invisible hand of economics, except for organizations. It's what really guides interactions and behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have a background in education policy.
Mhm.
I currently work in education policy,
Cool.
and it's interesting when you work in policy. You have the written policy, what the policy says, and then there's this practice that's not necessarily written down. This, like you were saying,
Exactly.
the unacknowledged rules that are at play that no one has necessarily written down or structured that way. And I'm finding that a lot. And then also what I'm finding is that the expression of the rules, whether they are written or not written,
Hmm.
varies across the different organizational areas, and how people are accountable to rules also varies. And that kind of gets into issues of equity and justice within organizations as well. So I've found that to be really, really fascinating. Just because you have a policy or something written down doesn't mean it's going to be applied equally across the organization or applied at all, right? It's just that sometimes there's no sort of standard consciousness among everyone in the organization about, or a different understanding of the importance or the priority of those set rules.
Those are really good points. And yeah, but yeah, working with policy is really interesting, precisely of what you said. And there is a tendency to think that we can shape culture by changing policy.
Mm.
And it's so much more complicated than that.
It's much more complicated than that. Now, what is it on the flip side? What do you think organizational culture is not? What do you think some of the myths are about organizational culture?
Yeah, so I mean, as we touched upon, this idea that by writing new rules, by writing new policies, you will automatically shift a culture. I mean, they're somewhat related, but they're not. There isn't a one-to-one correspondence. And
Right.
similarly, there's so many organizations these days that do the values work. We're going to write down our values, we're going to write our mission, this is going to guide everything. So
Mhm.
this idea that a culture book or a values statement, or even that a list of aspirational values, it can somehow change organizational culture, is often very misunderstood. And because culture is really, like you said, it's in the practices,
Mhm.
it's in what happens in the day to day. It's not in what's written down. And so, yeah, I would say that culture is not those things. It's not
Right.
what you aspire to be, and it's not what you say that you are.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's interesting. My next question was, how do you see the relationship between policies such as company policy and organizational culture? I feel like we kind of covered that, but I'm wondering if you have any more insights to that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would acknowledge that the policies are important, right? And that the policies, they need to be there, they need to be in place. But more so than just being stated, or just being written down or just existing, there is the life of the policy is what really happens on the ground,
Hmm.
and in how it is applied and how it is followed and how it is practiced. And it's the same for values, or it's the same for any kind of statement that we hope will guide culture. Um, culture culture is alive and it's happening. It's not, it doesn't live on a paper.
Right.
And so while I think that those policies are extremely important, it's also what we do with them and how we embody them and how we live them in the day-to-day workings of an organization that is really going to shape culture.
So can you tell us more about some insights in organizational behavior or culture that you've gained in your work that would be helpful to others?
Sure. There's a lot to think about, but I guess and going back to this idea of the relationship between culture and policy, I think that a lot of my work, especially for example, with diversity issues in STEM,
Mm-hmm.
was really about that, right? Was about, well, you might have this extremely forward-thinking organization with on-site daycare, great facilities, great maternity leave policies, supports for women of all sorts. And yet, you might find that the unspoken type of rules of the culture continue to be dominated by certain let's say masculine tendencies or something like that. So when we're thinking about diversity, when we're thinking about how to be more inclusive, the policies are obviously very, very important, and they have to be there. But we also have to think about how are things like you know household tasks, like how are they spoken about in the workplace, how are they acknowledged, how is the invisible work that women might be doing acknowledged within the organization. So little things like even in a very forward thinking organization, when a meeting happens, women are interrupted more often, they speak less, they're more often asked to do the invisible not valuable work of taking meeting notes, of sending a follow-up, all these little invisible tasks. They're asked more often to sit on hiring committees, to do all these little extra things, these little extra tasks that aren't acknowledged and aren't really taken into account when it really comes to promotion or salary raises or anything like that. And so it's really in examining and looking inward and examining these day-to-day practices that are happening, and examining how they align with values, how they align with culture, how they align with stated policies, that we're going to get at the difficult work of grappling with what needs to change and how do we go about it. So I'm not even sure if I answered your question, and I
Okay.
apologize if I digressed. But I
Being an
would say that it is
anthropologist,
valuable
yeah.
for any organization to practice this, like looking in.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, being an anthropologist, no matter what question you ask, how the respondent answers is just fine, right? Because you're going to get information that you never even thought of before, right? So
Yeah.
it's all good. And I was even thinking while you were talking about, for example, these companies that have great support services for women, but yet their culture is not, I guess you could say, woman friendly, for lack of a better
Mhm.
term.
Mhm.
And I could often see that taking sort of the form of, yes, women have all these supports. Maybe there's a daycare center, maybe there's a clinic or something there, that if they use it, they might be stigmatized for using it, right?
Right, right.
So, and the best example I think of is I have a family member who worked in a hospital for many years, and there was almost a sense of, if you didn't come in sick, you were weak. If you
Mm,
if you took advantage of some of the medical stuff or medical support services that were there, that was kind of a sign of weakness, and you didn't call in sick and this sort of thing. I'm thinking, that's a hospital, right? So that's a
right.
place where you know uh, doctors will tell you, are you getting enough sleep at night, right? you know
Right.
and that sort of thing. And yet they're probably, functioning on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. And so
themselves.
while you're taking your medication, or, let me write your note so you don't have to come into work. But yet, if somebody there doesn't come into work because they're sick, then that's like stigmatized in some way.
Exactly.
So, have you found that in any of your discoveries, where there's like, if you do partake in the support services, there's some kind of negativity, or maybe they even see women who, say, well, I don't do any of that. I don't bring my kids in, or that sort of thing. And there's sort of this bravado behind it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that we see, for example, I studied academic institutions specifically at one point, and um, one thing that you saw, for example, is that they would have these great maternity leave policies, right? So that, let's say, a female professor who gives birth to a child can take, a full year sabbatical without teaching, and so on, and and come back as if nothing had happened, tenure extension, so that she wasn't on the tenure clock, while she was on maternity leave, and all these things. And then at the same time, when these women go up for tenure, that extra year, it's almost still considered like, what did you do with that extra year? Why
Right.
is it that and so there is, in a sense, the punishing of women for taking advantage of that time. And then there's also, in more subtle and less obvious ways, when that same, female professor, especially like in competitive fields like engineering, she can't really take the time off her research.
Right.
So even though the university says that she can, if the following year she's going to be applying for a competitive grant, from the NIH, or from wherever it is that money's coming in from her research and for her lab, they're going to be saying, what did she produce last year? There wasn't enough publication. There wasn't enough this or that. And those very policies, of not being able to, they're meant to protect women, but an application for a grant like that will never ask about whether you had children, or whether you've been on maternity leave recently. And that's kind of like a double-edged sword, because there's just nowhere there where someone can state or explain in a way that's acceptable, to our society, that they happen to be on maternity leave, or that they gave birth, to twins and had a complicated recovery, or anything like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yep. That's definitely something that happens. So going back to your experience there, you did a startup in China.
Yes.
And what insights did you gain from the business organizational culture in China?
Well, China is just such a different culture in so many ways, that almost, I feel like I could write tomes about business culture in China. I think that one of the big things, like one of the big picture things that I learned, was just about how, even definitions of work life separation, and of what is, deemed appropriate, even in China versus like the Western world, are like just that cultural understanding of where work and life, like where that line is, are really, really different. So, for example, in China, people work a lot. The hours are long, the work is grueling, and it's just kind of expected that it is that way. And especially if you're in the services industry, your customers, they like having access to your personal phone number is very, very common, your personal cell phone number.
Wow.
And this idea that you're on call basically 24/7, no matter what happens, is very, very prevalent there. And even with, working with a Chinese CEO or something like that, you know, it's your day off. They might call you up, you're about to head to the movies, and they're like, Romina, what are you up to today? Can you come in? you know, And it might not even be anything urgent. It's just kind of nice to have you there at that moment. And it's just like and similarly, things like gift giving in corporate settings is something that was very different and very unique and difficult to navigate for a Westerner, like being given expensive gifts by clients with the tacit understanding that they might, their account might receive special treatment, or that they might receive more of your attention, and how to navigate that was often complicated. So there are a lot of cultural differences. And I would say to anyone, who's going to China for business, maybe just reading or trying to understand as much as possible about, what to expect is really, really important. Everything there is different, from how you sit yourself around a table to how to take someone's business card with both hands, and to show respect, to communicate. It all looks, it's like world of difference. So
It's interesting about the gift giving, because of course here that would be considered unethical, right?
yeah.
Of accepting a gift. I've been in companies where the policy is nothing over $20, So, and in China, if you get an expensive gift like that, is it expected that you would favor that particular client?
I mean, it's never spoken about like that. And in fact, in our company, when we realized just how the situations were making people like uncomfortable, or people, our Western associates and the people who worked with just didn't know exactly what to do, or how to behave. We had to formalize that in our contract with customers, that no gifts of any kind would be accepted, and that while the thought would be appreciated, that like no gifts would be accepted. And then they find ways to maneuver around that too. So like later on, it might be, well, can I take you out to dinner after, after work? And then it might be like an extremely lavish, 10-course Chinese meal at a really expensive, and then, you're like, oh man, okay, we have to talk about this now. So there are just ways in which the business culture there's a lot of unspokens, like we talked about. And so while no one would ever explicitly, say that, that this is an exchange, there would kind of almost be an increased pressure, almost in the form of more, extra phone calls, or like middle of the night, like just taking certain licenses that might sometimes come, close together with a dinner or a gift. And that we began to realize, oh, like they seem to associate the two things, or, you've accepted this gift, and now it should be okay for me to call you at midnight on a Saturday and to expect you to, to be available right away for something that's not really an urgent matter.
Right.
So it's something there are lots of things to navigate there that you have to think about really carefully, that probably, just wouldn't really come up in the same way in another setting.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you today. Is there anything else that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think that one of the themes that recently that Epico has really been working with, and that has emerged as really important, is just within people and within culture, there's a really strong appeal and an importance of leadership, right? And of the people at the top, and how that they can really, really influence culture. And I think if there is like one outsized influence that we've found in so many of the different types of organizations that we've worked with, is the outsized type of influence that a leader can have. And so when we talk about, how is it that we can shape culture, and how is it that that organizations can transform the way that they operate, I really think that alongside these new policies, the values work and all that, working with leadership to make sure that the cultures and the espoused values that you want to see, that those leaders are not just talking the talk, but are really walking the walk, is a really important and extremely influential way to shape organizations and to shape culture. And that's a big part of the work that we've been doing. And it was something that I wanted to touch upon today, as something that we really value and have found extremely important.
I agree. A lot of people talk about culture change, and they feel that, cultural change within an organization is best when it's bottom up. But I think sometimes that concept kind of puts leaders off the hook in a way. And that top down is also extremely important because, when you work in any workplace, and basically in every workplace I have ever worked, if there isn't buy-in about what you're doing from the top, you can forget it because it's not going to happen. And so that power structure and that concentration of power is there for a reason. And sometimes I find that leaders, sort of grapple with when to leverage their power, for change or some process or business change that goes on, and when to kind of handle things with kid gloves, And there's this, I think within leadership, there's this constant battle of, how will I look and how will I appear? And am I being a good leader here? Am I not being a good leader here? What will people think of me? Because part of that being in that leadership is that image and that, reputation that goes on. But I also want to go back to what you were saying about sort of modeling the behavior, is even within that leadership team, whether they're VPs or C-level executives or whatever it is, they have to model it with each other, right?
Exactly.
And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of anxiety, similar, this sort of, what do you say, stigmatism and judgment that goes on, and sort of this punitive accountability and who's in, who's out, who's hot, who's not, within that leadership space. And I think if we can address those issues within that leadership space, that will help the culture be less volatile, I guess you could say, in the long run.
Definitely.
Have you found that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think that, what you said about bottoms up and, this idea of grassroots, of things that come from them, I think that's super important as well. But what leadership needs to remember is that exactly what you said, they're modeling the behavior, and the organization in the end is going to mirror what they themselves see as important, because these are the behaviors that are rewarded, right? You can't say that you strive for a cooperative culture when it's the cutthroat people who who deliver the results in any way, that are getting raised and getting raises and getting promoted, right? So how is it that you reward for the culture that you want to see, and how is it that you model that? You can't say that you're a culture that promotes a work-life balance when the CEO is, seen working 100-hour weeks and never leaving the office. Everyone that works under that person is going to feel a certain pressure as well to be present, to be there, and so on. So it has to come from both directions. And again, remembering that those values and that culture that you want to create, there have to be rewards for that, and recognition.
You just froze for a second, but it's fine.
Okay.
It wasn't too bad. Well, it's only time through the whole video, so we're doing great. Well, Romina, I really thank you. We covered a lot of ground today. I love it. I love it. So thank you so much for doing this. Stay in touch, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Definitely. I've enjoyed a lot of your videos. I have watched some of them, and I'm going to continue to watch them. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of your project. And I think you're doing a great thing putting out there to the world what anthropologists can bring to business.
Thank you so much, Romina. I appreciate that. Okay, bye now.
Bye.